Very excited to have Bruce here tonight. Bruce is an IT professional and an associate professor at BYU, is that right?
Adjunct.
An adjunct. Yes. And I know him as a novelist. I've had the privilege of reading what I think is now the first two books, is that right?
There are three out there now, but
And I think when I read it, didn't you then split it, what I had read into two?
well, no, you actually had never read the third portion. So there's an entire third
There's like
portion.
very good, called Carthago, which is I take it a reference to Cato the Elder, the Roman statesman who famously ended all of his speeches in the Senate, Delenda est Carthago, Carthage, their enemy must be destroyed. It is not a Roman Punic War novel. It is a novel about sort of the 80s to the near future-ish, maybe, and about Silicon Valley and industrial espionage and nuclear war. And I think we may even hear a bit about that later today.
Yeah.
So, Bruce, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, I've been attending these. Dave's been asking me for some time, you know, is there anything you'd like to talk about? And I thought, well, you know, I'm a geek. People hear about IT all the time and so on. But as he mentioned, my co-author Bruce Henderson and I are writing these series of novels about limited nuclear war. Now, I happen to already, for reasons that I really can't remember how I got on there, I'm on a private listserv of LDS professionals involved or interested in national security. And I found out from that one of the list members, Dr. Kerry Karshner, was coming to BYU for a year as a visiting professor, and he was teaching a class last semester on nuclear strategy and American diplomacy. And I sent him an email and said, can I sit in? He said, sure. It was an absolutely fascinating class. A lot of the information here is drawing from what I learned from the textbooks in that class, from our lectures. Dr. Karshner spent many years doing actual arms negotiation and verification for both the U.S. State Department and the Pentagon, and had lots of interesting tales to tell. Beyond that, I am a child, as I can see a few of you here, I am a child of the atomic age. Sun Tzu is another interest of mine. I actually have written a book based on the writings of Sun Tzu, and this is how he opens The Art of War, written about 2,500 years ago. Warfare is the great affair of the state, the field of life and death, the way, the Tao of preservation and extinction. It cannot be left unexamined. There is necessity to understand the forces and factors behind war and the consequences. Now, war itself is timeless, and I would strongly recommend for those who think there were peaceful, savages were peaceful, if you will, go read War Before Civilization by Kinley, which shows just frankly how violent and vicious pre-industrial civilizations were. But the technology changes. I'm going to play some video of the Baker blast for Operation Crossroads, July of 1946. These, Able and Baker, were the first two nuclear explosions anywhere in the world after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, I have a particular tie into this. My father was there. My father joined the Navy at age 17, wanting to see the world. He found himself 6 months later at Pearl Harbor, and then at the naval battle of Guadalcanal, and then going ashore with the Marines in the invasion of Guam. Came home in December of 1945, convinced my mom to break her current engagement and elope with him. Got married, got pregnant, got her pregnant, and they got sent off to the South Pacific for these tests. What you will see in these videos, you will see the Navy's got several dozen ships anchored at various distances from this nuclear blast. He was part of the crews that went on board those ships afterwards to assess the damage, to see how recoverable the ships were from an atomic blast, and to try to decontaminate them. I will simply note here at passing, of the several dozen ships, there were only about 8 or 9 that were ever successfully decontaminated. and they were scrapped afterwards. The rest were simply sunk. They were too thoroughly irradiated. So what you have here, Able and Baker were the two blasts. Able was a airdrop, and for reasons that still don't explain, the pilots actually missed the ship they were aiming for. And so it was very unsatisfactory result. So for Baker, they put it at the bottom of the lagoon. This is Bikini Atoll. So you've got a nuclear device under 90 feet of water with the ships anchored at various distances from ground zero. And this is what you get. You get this column of water, millions of tons of water going straight up, and it starts to come down, and you get what's called a base surge that's coming out. This is a radioactive mix of water and sand from the bottom. It's engulfing these ships, capsizes a number of them. I will note, this is a small bomb. This is 23 kilotons, still a little bit bigger than Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which were around 15 to 17 kilotons. Very small by modern standards. But you can see the tremendous impact of what is a very simple, and at this point, still pretty primitive device. Here you can watch the shock wave come across the water. You can actually see the line coming across, and then you'll see it hit the palm trees and then the camera. This was 70 years ago. This is what nuclear devices were 70 years ago. We do have close to 70 years of advancement on them. We don't do testing anymore. We used to, but the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was finally adopted. Does anyone have an idea of how many nuclear devices the U.S. actually exploded for testing purposes before the final test ban came into effect? Anyone want to make a guess? 1,000. We exploded 1,000 nuclear bombs. Did it in the atmosphere, did it underwater, did it underground, did a few up in space. Anyone know when the last nuclear bomb explosion was set off by the United States for testing purposes? 1992. I learned that, I was surprised. I thought the test ban had actually ended before then.
Well, the stadium of fire felt like one.
Yeah, yes. The fascinating thing now is that a lot of the, come on in if you want to come in, a lot of the videos from these nuclear tests have now been declassified over the past several years. And you can literally find dozens and dozens of videos of nuclear explosions under a number of circumstances out on the internet. This is a direct top-down view. You can see wait, this stops in a nice spot here. The column of water still up there. Now, the technology changes from time to time, and so do the stakes. This is a classic, and you'll find different variations of this. This is a map projecting the consequences of a full nuclear exchange on the United States. The red zones are places where you have major wildfires as a result. The colors indicate level of fallout and the intensity of the fallout there, the level of exposure. Now, with the end of World War II, with the result of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, a great debate started that continues literally to this day. There are two fundamental approaches to nuclear strategy. One is assured destruction. We sometimes call it mutually assured destruction, but that's more popularly used within the policy world. It's usually just called assured destruction. And the other is called damage limitation. These both stem from books that were written in 1946. Bernard Brodie wrote one called The Absolute Weapon, where he said the only feasible strategy and approach for nuclear weapons is assured destruction. which means a deliberate targeting of the civilian population and all the things that support the civilian population, including agriculture and industry. The only effective threat we have is to say, if you attack us, we will kill all your people. Horribly. The second approach, which William Worden touted at the same time, is and by the way, that's called counter value. These are two terms you'll hear, nuclear strategy terms. Counter value means we're going to destroy anything of value. Your civilians, your cities, your agriculture, your industry, we're going to destroy it all. Counter force means we're going to leave your civilians alone. We're going to take out your nuclear weapons. That's what we're targeting. And we'll either take them out preemptively so you can't attack us, or we will take them out so that you can't continue to attack us. And his book was called There Will Be No Time. Focus there is on mid-range and tactical weapons with low yields, meaning the actual force of the blast. The idea being, should nuclear weapons get introduced into a conflict, there is room to de-escalate. You have killed 50 million people, you've killed 3 million soldiers, and there's still room to back down. This debate has been raging, it still rages to this day, as to which is the most effective approach. The interesting thing are the destabilization efforts. A lot of the hostility for any sort of missile defense or anti-ballistic missile system is from people who want assured destruction. Because if someone could truly come up with an effective ABM system, it completely negates that strategy. It means if someone tries to launch a preemptive attack on you, you can knock most of it out, and you're sitting pretty, and they've just basically used up their weapons. For damage limitation, the great areas of destabilization are first a preemptive first strike. Damage limitation assumes an escalation. If there is a massive preemptive first strike, you have no counterforce value left, unless it's somehow survivable. It's also destabilized by MIRV devices. MIRV stands for Multiple Independently Targeted Reentry Vehicles. We, the Soviets, and I think by now the Chinese, all have missiles that can launch, get up into a suborbital path, and then launch anywhere from 8 to 12 independent warheads, each of which can be targeted. A number of them also will launch 8 to 10 decoys that look just like the targeted vehicles. So suddenly from one missile you've got 20 things streaming in on your country, 10 of which are bogus, and you don't know which ones you can effectively take out by any sort of ABM system. Now, with assured destruction, the great minds say that for an effective counter value, you need to be able to wipe out half the population and a third of industry. So, a counter value against the United States would mean a target intended to take out roughly 150 million Americans on first strike. The force required, and these numbers are probably up some, but because people tend to cluster, I mean this goes back 50 years, but it's probably still not that far off. 400 equivalent megatons. An equivalent megaton means basically something that actually lands and fires. It lands and goes off. There is a general rule of thumb in nuclear strategy that it's going to take 2 warheads to get the effective one, because of issues with whether or not the missile launches, whether or not the warhead functions properly, whether or not it lands on its target. So if you figure you need 10 megatons to take out an entrenched target, you're going to have to launch 20 megatons worth of warheads against it. Now, at that same time, what you have instead is both the United States Navy, our 2 nuclear forces are United States Navy with subs, and U.S. Air Force, which covers both missiles and bombers. They each wanted to have 400 megatons because they didn't want to rely on the other one. And because of this 2-to-1 ratio of what could actually go through, they said what we actually need are 400 survivable tons. So the estimate here is about 30,000 warheads, and you will see that figure on the chart I'm going to show you in a second. Now, with Borton, damage limitation strategy, all you care about, you don't care about how much the population, you're not targeting population. You just want to be able to destroy known weapons, hardened targets, and ABM systems on the other side. And so the force required really depends on who you're protecting yourself against. There's a difference between protecting yourself against Russia and against China. China's nuclear force is much, much smaller. And certainly vastly different than protecting ourselves against North Korea, which has a very small number of nuclear warheads and still no clearly feasible means of getting it to the U.S. yet. Now, with assured destruction, if deterrence fails, in other words, if your strategy of assured destruction does not deter your enemy, you're sunk. There's no coming back because your enemy has just launched a preemptive nuclear strike to take out at least half your population. With damage limitation, if it fails, then what you want to do is have a counterforce strike able to limit or defeat any further enemy attack. If the enemy launches an initial strike and it's not everything, you want to be able to take out what's ever left there. Now, this is what we've survived so far in the past 7 years. Some things here that sort of surprised me as much as that I followed politics and military history and so on. U.S. hit its all-time peak in nuclear warheads in the early 60s. We've been declining ever since, by almost a factor of 10 over that period. We were just above 30,000, remember that number? In the early 60s, we were at about 30,000 nuclear warheads. Today, we have about 4,000 active warheads. We have about 2,000 retired warheads because it's not easy and necessarily safe to dismantle nuclear warheads. You end up with lots of radioactive material, you have lots of components. It's sort of, in some cases, it's easier to simply disable it and mothball it because it already has its radioactive shield or radiation shielding on it. Another interesting thing is that when we had, now, for those of you, I was all of 7 years old in 1970 when Kennedy ran, so this is something that's even ancient history to me. When Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he accused Eisenhower and the Republican administration of having created a missile gap. Somehow there was this missile gap between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and this left us vulnerable. Well, what you actually see in 1960 is that Russia had maybe 100 nuclear warheads, and we had about 25,000. There was no gap there. We had massive overkill in terms of our nuclear forces versus the Soviet forces. But the other thing you see is that starting basically around 1965, with the exception of one little blip here in the early 70s, our stockpile has been declining for 50 years. Notice what the Soviets kept doing up until about 1984. There was a complaint at that time by, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember who it was. Not a president, but one of the higher up in U.S. government, who said, we build warheads, they build warheads. We stop building warheads, they build warheads. We start dismantling warheads, they build warheads. That's pretty much what was happening all the way up till about 1985. You see the Soviets, by that point, had not quite doubled the number we had. You were starting to ask something?
Well, I want to, do you want to just save all questions until the
No, you can ask a question now.
So if we're just mothballing them for like hasn't our stockpile stayed exactly the same?
Oh, no, we have dismantled a lot. We've dismantled a tremendous number. What I'm saying is, you know, we used to be at 30,000. We now have a total of about 6,000.
I mean, but when you
4,000 are active, 2,000 are still assembled, but they've been disabled and stored somewhere. They're not deployed anywhere. So it's not like you can run out and say, load this onto the missile and we're going to fire it. They take a bit more than that. Yeah.
So, there's obviously in the beginning when we first created nuclear weapons, I mean they were fairly primitive. They weren't probably as technologically advanced as they are now. I would think. Does that have something to do with a decrease in the stockpile, or also that's one question. Two was how does the nuclear treaties play into the reduction in stockpiles? We see this.
Well, we'll talk about some of that in a second. Yeah, there is some improvement, but mostly it's improvement in lightweight, and frankly, a lot of the primary advances came right in this period. We had the invention of the hydrogen bomb. Starting around here, you had the invention of multi-independent vehicles. You started having nuclear missiles on subs. And so it's not like, you know, the biggest bombs that have ever been fired off were all fired off pretty much back here. Particularly the bomb Tsara by the Soviet Union, which was the single largest test bomb ever done.
I guess
So the idea is you want, and the thing is, we haven't actually tested any of our bombs since 1992, which is like, what, 25 years ago.
yeah.
So all our testing is by computer modeling. And there are concerns as to whether or not, how many of these would actually work if used. Frankly, I think that concern is probably greater on the part of the Soviets, because their technology, bluntly, is not as advanced.
Yeah. Just one more
Sure.
comment too. I would think, I mean, even though you see a very sharp decline in the number of warheads available, my guess is that even those would kill anyone on either side 10 times over.
No, nuclear war is much more survivable than that.
Yeah.
That's one of the things we're going to talk about. But the nuclear war directly is much more survivable than that. And with the number of weapons they have, and with the missile defenses you have on both sides, it's interesting because the Soviets have always been furious about U.S. efforts to build ballistic defense, yet they have the world's most massive missile defense systems surrounding Moscow. They have missile defenses. They basically have 100 emplacements of missile defense around Moscow to make it as survivable as possible. Now, one of the other interesting things that I discovered in this class, I was sort of expecting wild swings back and forth based on administration and party and so on, as far as approach to nuclear strategy, nuclear war. And by and large, that wasn't the case. When you got down to what was actually practiced by successive administrations, it did not vary that much. The big change, probably the biggest change you saw, was under Truman and Eisenhower, you had this tremendous U.S. superiority in the number of warheads. Their plan was if the Soviets did anything, we would massively retaliate, and we could, we had 10, 20, 100, well not 100, but we had so many more weapons. But at that point, most of our weapons were being delivered by bombers. Those of you who have ever read the novel Failsafe or watched the movie, it's about a glitch in the targeting system that leads a U.S. bomber crew to head to Moscow and drop a nuclear bomb, in spite of everyone's efforts to try and get it to come back. But what we often don't think about, when we talk about Sputnik, we think, oh, the U.S. panicked because it showed how advanced they were scientifically. No, the U.S. panicked because we had bombers that would take several hours to reach the Soviet Union. The Soviet, by showing they could orbit something, could put an atomic bomb in orbit and basically hit anywhere in the U.S. in less than 30 minutes' notice. And we had zero defense. Our air defense systems wouldn't work for that or anything. It was an absolute end run around U.S. nuclear strategy and defense policy. And this is why you had the big missile race in the late 50s and early 60s. A lot of it was focused on nuclear strategy and the development of ballistic missiles. Now, what you'll see here is a trend. Under Kennedy and Johnson, there was a leaning towards flexible response. The Soviets weren't having a lot of it, and finally they sort of went back to assured destruction. Now, here's something to keep in mind. And this is, just the other day I listened to Dream of the Blue Turtle, Sting's album, which has a song, If the Russians Love Their Children Too. It's a great song, but it misses a fundamental worldview difference between the Soviet Union and the US. How many attacks did we suffer on US territory during World War II? Pretty much one. We had some island properties in the Philippines were protected.
Or Aleutian Island.
Yeah, Aleutian Islands, yes, the Aleutian Islands. Had Pearl Harbor, we had some firebombs that drifted over and so on. What happened to the Soviets? They were not just invaded, they were invaded by someone they had a pact with. They had a non-aggression pact with Hitler. And with no notice or warning, he turned around, invaded them, and he got within 20 miles of Moscow. Now imagine if the US capital were in Chicago, and the Nazis had invaded America and had gotten within 20 miles of Chicago. You'd probably have quite a different mindset. The Soviets, and this is no positive commentary on this, but the Soviets have a reason to be paranoid. They were betrayed by Hitler, and it cost them millions and millions and millions of lives. Both of their soldiers and their citizens.
30 million.
The battle for Stalingrad, one battle, 6 months, one city, 1.1 million Red Army soldiers killed. So the Soviets are not trusting people. And their fear is basically another betrayal. They just aren't comfortable with, yeah, you can sign all these pacts and so on, but we don't necessarily believe it. Of course, the Russians now, but so said, one of the core issues we face right now is that Putin considers the dissolution of the Soviet Union to be a tremendous historical tragedy, and he is seeking very hard to reestablish Russian, at least, dominance, if not outright control, of what they call the near abroad, which is pretty much the possessions that in Eastern Europe and so on that they have. You had a question?
Yeah, just to add to that, fact that you talked about the Russian suffering in World War II, but actually, throughout their history, they've had a history of invasions, foreign invaders. The Mongols, Napoleon.
Oh yes, Napoleon also got
So
about 20 miles.
it's just not World War II.
Yeah.
It's just an entire history of foreign invaders. So that is a big part of Russian mentality, as you pointed out.
So this is and remains a big issue between the U.S. and the Soviet Union as far as nuclear strategy goes. Now the interesting thing is that really starting in '68 and for the last 50 years, the U.S. nuclear strategy has been largely consistent. Ostensibly, the official policy tends to be assured destruction. Anyone attack us, we're going to wipe you out. The actual internal strategy is more damage limitation. If nuclear weapons get used, we want to minimize their use, we want to de-escalate as quickly as possible. We don't want things escalating. You started having, especially under Bush 41, massive reductions in warhead stockpiles. Proliferation went a lot slower than people were fearing. Back in the 60s, there was a fear that everyone was going to get the bomb. And actually, it's been much slower and much fewer countries have gotten involved. Now this was something interesting. President Obama, Prague, 2009, it was just a couple months, I think March, just a couple months after his inauguration, goes to Prague and says, you know, it may not happen in our lifetime, but we want to see a world free of nuclear weapons. Made that a stated goal of his administration. By 2012, he's basically saying, no, Russians aren't playing along. This isn't going to happen. We need to continue a firm nuclear policy against the Russians because they just simply aren't playing along. In fact, one of the books I'll recommend, it was one of our textbooks. It's called The Case for U.S. Nuclear Weapons in the 21st Century. Okay? Brad Roberts. Brad Roberts was in charge of nuclear policy in the Obama administration. And he writes and publishes a book saying, this is why we need nuclear weapons. So that's about as real politic as you can get. Under President Trump, there has been a refocus on modernizing some of the U.S. nuclear arsenal because frankly, a lot of these designs do date back 20 or 30 years. The Soviets, back in 1987, I've got it on the next slide, or one of the coming slides, we signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which basically, the idea was to de-escalate nuclear weapons in Europe, because we have a lot of nuclear weapons there, we mean the United States. And so it's kind of like, okay, let's get rid of tactical weapons. Tactical weapons are typically a damage limitation weapon. We're going to focus on strategic weapons, you know, long-range missiles, multiple warheads. Those are counterforce. Those are sure destruction ones. The problem is, almost from day one, the Soviets have continued to violate the INF Treaty and continue to build tactical nuclear weapons and design new tactical nuclear weapons. And the U.S. just a few months ago basically said, that's it. Soviets haven't been honoring this for decades. We're pulling out of the INF Treaty. We're reserving the right to build our own tactical nuclear weapons. One of the reasons is because the Soviet Union, the Russians, have tactical nukes that they can use against Europe, and we have nothing to counter that with. All we have are strategic weapons. So the Soviets suddenly decided we're going to move aggressively into Eastern Europe, and they met resistance with some, low-yield tactical nukes. We have no counterforce to that. Our only counterforce is to launch strategic counter-value weapons, and that truly does risk assured destruction. So the U.S. is now looking at some new weapons, including, ironically, sub-launch tactical nuclear weapons. Now, submarines are used as survivable weapons for a counter-strike in case, you have a massive initial first strike against, U.S. mainland or military forces, whatever. The idea of our subs are out hiding somewhere and they can launch a counter-strike. So they are, by definition, strategic, multiple warhead, and so on. But with tactical weapons on subs, it means that we can launch low-yield tactical weapons against a Russian incursion into Europe without triggering a full counter-value strike. And I will note that Trump also gave a call, largely ignored, in December for Russia and China and the U.S. to sit down for significant nuclear disarmament. Yes?
How big is the Russian submarine force compared to ours?
That's a good question. I'm sure it's smaller and it's in less repair, but they have some really good subs and they've got a lot of missiles on their subs. So, I would have to be honest, you could probably Google and find out the numbers very quickly. And I was gonna, I feel bad now, because I almost put up a chart and said, okay, let's talk about the number of warheads, number of subs, number of planes, number of whatever, for each of the 5 official nuclear powers. But it's, as I stand here, I'm pretty sure their numbers are lower. Their technology, generally speaking, isn't good, but they do have some really good technology, and I'm sure they've got some deep, quiet subs with a lot of nuclear missiles on them. You study nuclear strategy, you'll hear constant reference to the nuclear taboo. The really remarkable thing is, in 73 years, we've never used another nuclear weapon in conflict. No one has. No one has used a nuclear weapon since the bombing of Nagasaki in 1945. And it's referred to as a nuclear taboo because no one really wants to be the first one to break that. Now, have we come close? Well, I don't know if we've come close. There have been times when there has been considered use, not in terms of, say, the Cuban Missile Crisis, but in terms of other wars using it. There was a great internal debate during the Korean War as to, particularly when you had Chinese forces rushing in off the Chinese border down into Korea, whether to use nuclear weapons to stop them. China didn't have anything to counter, but the problem is the Soviets were supporting the Korean communists as well, and that could have triggered some response by the Soviet Union. We didn't. The French, fighting the French Indochina War, they actually had the Indochina forces largely bottled up, and they made some approaches to the U.S. saying, if you dropped a nuclear bomb there, that would pretty much end the war and end our problems here. And the U.S. said, no, not going to do it. On the other hand, you had a number of U.S. military leaders who were debating use of nuclear weapons in the Vietnam War as well. And there was at least a pro forma consideration in the first Iraq War driving Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait of using nuclear weapons. Interestingly enough, one of the arguments there is it really didn't make much effect. The troops were in the desert and scattered out. And as we're going to talk about in a minute, nuclear weapons are not magic. The effect falls off on an inverse square rule. If you have troops spread out over miles, you drop a bomb and it's kind of like dropping a baseball on a long trail lance. It's going to wipe out a small group there, but it's not going to do much for the rest of it. Now, a lot of what is behind the nuclear taboo is the assured destruction concept, that if anyone uses any nuclear weapon, catastrophic escalation will inevitably result. Problem is, we've never proven that, and of course, it's the sort of thing that if you're wrong, or if you're right, depending on how you look at it, it's a pretty horrible outcome. But the challenge is that if nuclear weapons are ever used and there is not significant escalation, then a number of countries are going to look and say, hey, we can also use nukes and get away with it. Once nuclear taboo is broken, and I suspect it will be at some point, it is going to significantly change geopolitics. Yeah?
Why do you think it will be broken?
Because there are some crazy countries out there, and we'll talk about those in just a second, as to where nuclear weapons are most likely to be used. It's almost the last people who are going to end up using nuclear weapons are us and the Russians. It's not going to be us. It's going to be someone else with nuclear weapons who are going to use it. Yes?
Did they ever consider using nuclear weapons in the 2003 Iraq War, or had they already decided?
No, that was, we had too many feet on the ground. We're doing basically clean out. So I have run across nothing that ever considered that would be useful. It would probably have been counterproductive. Aside from using nuclear weapons, it would have been counterproductive militarily. It did not fit with the plan.
Makes sense.
So, Now, what kind of nuclear war scenarios do you have? You've got the preemptive nuclear first strike. This has sort of been the bugaboo for 70 years. It can either be a counterforce strike or a countervalue strike. Counterforce meaning you're targeting the other side's weapons, military assets, so on and so forth. Countervalue means you're targeting civilians, cities, farms, factories. You're trying to devastate the other company. Next scenario is what we've been talking about, which is limited or tactical nuclear use in an actual aggressive attack. This is, for example, Russia reinvaded Eastern Europe, and as NATO forces started to gather to counter it, dropped a few tactical nukes on them. You have first nuclear use against an escalating biological, chemical, or conventional attack. The U.S. nuclear strategy policy basically reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in those situations. In other words, if someone were unleashed, if another country unleashed a weaponized version of, say, pneumonic plague on the U.S., we reserve the right to turn around and drop a nuclear bomb on it. Massive cyber attack. This is actually recently added to it, and I was really surprised when this came up in class. I thought, I'm a geek. It's like, what, they knock out our internet and we bomb them? But then, not long after we actually had that discussion in class, I read a General Accounting Office report that talked about the very poor levels of digital security for U.S. weapons systems and how vulnerable they were. So if an enemy released something equivalent to the Stuxnet virus, which was used to actually destroy a lot of the uranium centrifuges in Iran, something like that on U.S. weapons systems, and suddenly we found large numbers of weapon systems disabled, unusable, or imperfect in their use because of the cyber attack. We reserve the right to retaliate on a nuclear level. Catalytic use. You have two parties in conflict, and either the battle is escalating, not nuclear conflict. It's either escalating to pose a danger to a more general sphere of things, or you have, again, use of chemical, biologicals, and so on weapons. And you have a nuclear attack to basically intervene and cause it to stop. You have an accidental launch or detonation. Some of our closest Cold War incidents have been through, and I should also there put out false positives. There have been a number of rather chilling incidents from the height of the Cold War where there were one side or the other believed we were under attack due to flaws in the detection systems. And the attack was forestalled, and we're all still here. And then you have an actual terrorist attack, either state-sponsored or even a non-state actor. Yes?
What about financial warfare, just the threat of using it so that you will pay them not to do it?
Oh, you mean?
Korea.
Yeah, basically threatening. Yeah, actually, that's still sort of in the politics range. That's the was it Will Rogers who said politics was the art of saying nice doggy until you pick up a big rock. That's miscalculation could in fact lead to that, and I think that's been some of the risk, mostly to North Korea, that if they get serious enough and if they really goof up on their threats, the U.S. could in fact do my suspicion is they would probably do a preemptive conventional strike, but they might even do a tactical nuclear strike and simply wipe out all the missile sites in North Korea. So there you go. We're not worried about you
Seems
anymore.
like their intent is not necessarily destruction as it is to get money.
Oh, I agree. I I think Kim Jong-un very much wants a West Palm Beach lifestyle. And he's trying to sort of negotiate himself into a way where he can finally say, okay, we'll give him up, and yeah, let's start building, resorts here along the coast. Now, major areas of nuclear tension right now. Biggest one is India and Pakistan. We're going to have 2 more slides after this one talking specifically about this. You have 2 nuclear states with long-standing, we're talking back to the 40s, disputes over territory, over politics, over religion, past wars, and neither one is a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They both have nuclear weapons in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Give you an idea, with Pakistan, the day of the year in which they detonated their first nuclear device is a national holiday. And the mountain where they do all their underground nuclear testing is a national monument. This is a great source of pride for them. The Middle East. The U.S., or the U.S., Israel has never officially stated whether or not it has nukes. The standard answer, yes, an Israeli prime minister, any of them. And their comment is always, Israel will never be the first country to use nuclear weapons within the Middle East. It's believed they've got about 90 warheads. Now, something you have to, and this is very interesting, and should any of the students from 470 watch this, you're all great students. But it almost became sort of a standing joke in the class because Dr. Karsha would ask a question and would look around, and it was sort of a historical question or a setting question or so on. And a number of times he said, does anyone but Bruce know the answer? And I don't say that for myself, but I was a bit surprised at the historical and geographical lack of knowledge of some of these students who are all seniors in political science. One thing that I pointed out in class that seemed to startle a number of them, Israel is 1/10 the size of Utah. Basically, Israel is 80 miles by 100 miles. That's sort of a Wasatch Front from, not even quite Ogden down to Spanish Fork and then back into the mountains. It is a tiny, tiny state surrounded by countries who do not want it to exist anymore, and it has nuclear weapons. This is a major nuclear flashpoint. Beyond that, within Islam, you have 2 major divisions, Sunni and Shia. They don't get along with each other. And you have a known nuclear power, Pakistan, which is Sunni. Their nuclear program is probably largely financed by Saudi Arabia, which is also Sunni. And then you have Iran, which is Shia. So you not only have the hostility of, say, Iran versus Israel, you have the hostility between Iran and Pakistan, and Iran and Saudi Arabia. Yes?
I read an article, I want to say it was about 5 years ago, from one of the big national, New York Times or somebody. So it turns out one of the occupations in the world with the highest mortality rate is Iranian nuclear scientists. They have an extremely high rate of car accidents and suicides and otherwise untimely deaths.
That's a lot of a lot of that is frankly Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, and Israel is very, very much vastly more concerned with Iran's nuclear program than anyone else. They were responsible just within the last year. Iran had claimed that it had destroyed all these materials related to nuclear weapons research, and Mossad went in and found all the materials in several storage containers in a big lot in Tehran, and basically photocopied everything and published it. And the trailers then mysteriously vanished from that spot. Iran moved them away. Russia Russia and the near abroad. Russia, as I said, under Putin, thinks the collapse of the Soviet Union, its dissolution, was a mistake. He is trying to reestablish a dominant position in the Baltic states, in basically what is now Eastern Europe. As I mentioned, they've got strong anti-ballistic missile installations around Moscow. They've invested heavily in tactical nuclear weapons. We're now having to figure out how to respond to that. And then you've got East Asia. China sees the 21st century as the century of China. They are working very aggressively at becoming a true world power, economically, militarily. This includes a lot of investment in nuclear weapons. They have lots of weapons that actually fit onto trucks. I mean, this is a bit like the old MX system that was originally proposed here in the US and then killed, where we're going to have train tracks all over Nevada and western Utah with missiles, and it's going to be a shell game. Chinese are building that, but they're doing it all underground. They have vast stretches of underground railways designed simply, or roadways to carry trucks and rail cars with nuclear weapons so that they can shuffle them around and no one can see the deployment and no one can do a counter-force strike on it. One of the most dangerous zones in the world right now is the South China Sea, where China is asserting territorial claims that literally no one else recognizes. They're building islands there and putting military forces on the islands. So the North Korean situation does seem to be de-escalating, and I think Kim Jong-un really just wants a nice lavish lifestyle, and sort of, I think he would be happy if he can sort of thread the needle to de-escalate, but it's still a wild card.
But if he does it, then don't you think other countries will say, well, let's do the same?
Well, that's actually a good issue, though. Our non-proliferations has done a good job of controlling proliferation elsewhere. Japan, yeah.
I was just one more thing on Korea, on North Korea specifically. How much of what we're seeing right now is potentially the fact that they have now run out of missile boosters? There is a belief that they purchased them from the Soviet Union,
Or possibly Pakistan.
or possibly Pakistan, both of whom have had, oddly enough, container ships show up in
Yep.
Korean waters, and now he's just like, okay,
I would not be
This is not-
surprised. I mean, there have been great efforts to try and interdict stuff going in there.
right. So I build and fly high performance model rockets.
Yeah.
I mean, really big stuff, 20,
Yeah.
30 feet tall. Well, I don't do 30 feet tall, but that kind of thing. So I know you don't go from
No,
this level of engine to that level of engine in no time.
you don't, and not only is that it, I mean, rocket science really is rocket science,
Right.
as all the commercial rocket ventures showed. Beyond that, it takes extra, there's one thing to build a device that you can detonate inside a mountain. To build a device that can survive the acceleration and vibration of a rocket launch is something entirely different. It has to be able to survive the launch. It has to, do the arc. You have re-entry, and then it has to have precise timing because you don't want to explode too soon or too late. You do have to explode it. Nuclear bombs don't go off because they run into something. Contrary to what you think. They're very specialized creations. They require a exquisite timing sequence. So if you launch a nuclear missile and it simply plows into the ground, you don't get a nuclear explosion. You might get a wet bomb because it may just compress the fissile material sufficiently to do momentary fission, but it's like more like a dirty bomb at that point. You're not talking nuclear or thermonuclear. Interesting thing is Japan. Japan, by most estimates, has a know-how and a technology that should Japan decide to build nuclear weapons, it could probably have them in months and possibly in weeks. It has exquisite engineering, it knows all the technology that's necessary, and oh, by the way, it has 40 tons of weapons-grade plutonium. It's got the material to build bombs. This is all produced, this has been produced in their reactors as reactor fuel. They don't keep it all. About half of that is actually stored in France and England on behalf of Japan, but they still have about 20 tons of plutonium, which is a lot. You don't need a lot of plutonium for a nuclear bomb. This is what keeps China up at night, more than the US. You have very long history of animosity between Japan and China. And what keeps China up is what would happen if Japan truly went nuclear.
I suppose there's that, but I also suppose that China's, China could launch something as a first strike, but the result of that is that it pulls the U.S.
It does.
immediately into it.
It does.
Giving Japan plenty of time to put together anything that they need to.
And we have about a 10-to-1 advantage in warheads over China.
Right.
They have their advantage is stuff is spread out, but China would not want to get into a full-blown nuclear exchange with us. They would lose that.
Yeah, the U.S. would end up doing counter value in that case instead of counter.
They probably would. They do an initial counter-force strike just to prevent any further launches, and then if China persists, they'd probably go counter value. Now, Dr. Karshner feels that India-Pakistan. Oh, I thought I corrected that. That's Pakistan, not Pakistan. This was a discussion he gave us in class as to his 12 reasons why he thinks that the next use of nuclear weapons will be India and Pakistan. First, as I mentioned, they have profound border disputes, which were drawn not by them, but by England, back in 1947, without a lot of respect of various tribal and political boundaries that were already existing.
Drawn by someone who had never been to India.
Yep, pretty much.
This is just normal for Britain.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether or not they have ever been there.
It actually was a man who'd never been.
Yeah, but
Let's see. We'll just put
but
the
it
line
doesn't even
there.
matter than that because they literally take whoever the minority is in a arbitrarily created space. and
Both
they
have
come
nuclear
to the
weapons.
top.
Both. They've actually already fought a number of conflicts, from minor to major conflicts over the past 7 years. This is an interesting one. India has civilian control of government. The military pretty much controls the Pakistani government, which means they tend to have very different priorities. It's one thing to sit down, if you have a civilian government, to sit down with another civilian government and say, we're concerned about this, we're concerned about that. If you try to have a discussion, you're a civilian government, they're a military government, or vice versa. You're going to talk at cross purposes. Pakistan itself is a failing state. You have high levels of corruption and instability in the upper reaches of government. You have a lot of intermixing between Pakistani government officials and extremist groups. It is not a stable democracy. It is very unstable. India has suffered a number of multiple serious terrorist attacks out of Pakistan, and they consider the Pakistani government to be complicit in those. At the very best, turning a blind eye, if not actively encouraging it. So they have very hostile feelings towards them. They have mutually destabilizing military postures. India has a stated cold start strategy of pre-positioning its military forces along the Pakistani border, so in case of conflict, they can immediately invade. Pakistan's response: we're going to deploy tactical nuclear weapons. If anything happens, you're going to get hit with nukes before you can invade. India's response: we now have strategic nuclear weapons on the far side of our country, away from you. If you do anything, we're going to launch those at you. Both are in defiance of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They pretty much ignore international pressure. This is an interesting one. Now, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act, part of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, basically says companies that are signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty cannot provide advice on nuclear weapon handling and care to countries that are not signatories. What this means is that the US can't go to Pakistan or India, but most notably Pakistan, and say, here's how you keep your nuclear weapons safe. Here's how you prevent control from not falling into hands of radical factions within the government. Now, added to that is the fact that neither India nor Pakistan really like the US all that much. So it says complicated relationships. And that puts it mildly. You have political, economic, and military asymmetries. India is bigger, it is richer, it has a larger military, it is far more stable in terms of government. Pakistan is less in all those areas, and so you have a greater likelihood, again, of miscommunication or simply provoke response leading the wrong way. And finally, as I mentioned, both have enormous national prestige tied up in the nuclear forces. Like I said, it's a national holiday every year. I think it's the 25th of May, the day we detonated our first bomb. So, that's most of that. I threw this slide in here because I knew, yes, David.
So I'm curious, and maybe I missed it, what about the possibility of non-state actors? I mean, I'm an ignoramus here. But like our suitcase nukes, is that a real thing?
They're more like big backpack nukes, and they're not that strong. You're looking at a couple of kilotons, which can still be pretty devastating. But there is tremendous focus on non-state nukes. And in fact, in a second, I'm going to give a brief overview. As Dave mentioned, my co-author Bruce Henderson and I are writing a series of novels about the first post-World War II use of nuclear weapons. It's being done for business purposes. And we've spent a lot of time considering very carefully what all the obstacles are and how to overcome them. Non-state actors are under a microscope. Frankly, if a non-state actor is likely to trigger something, it's probably because someone passed to them a functioning nuclear weapon. This is why Pakistan is so dangerous. There's a chance that one of the radical factions in Pakistan could basically say, here's the keys. You know, it's the third cupboard on the left. Get a truck and get it out of here, and they drive it up to, into Saudi Arabia or up to the Israeli border and set it off. So yeah, but that's where everyone tends to focus, quite frankly. Now, just a few things on nuclear weapons themselves, and these are just sort of things that tend to be wrong in movies and TVs. Nuclear winter, which was really popular in 1986, which basically said, if there's an all-out exchange between the US and Russia, you're going to have massive countrywide firestorms with soot that goes up to the stratosphere. It's going to circulate around the world, and you're going to see a cooling on the order of 25 degrees worldwide. And pretty much almost as soon as it came out, you had a lot of other scientists basically saying that makes no sense. There are real problems with the models here, which there were. This is still, the idea of nuclear winter is considered a very minority position. The most interesting real-world result was in the first Gulf War. You had Saddam Hussein set fire to the Kuwaiti oil fields. And you had a massive amount of thick black smoke and soot go up into the atmosphere, up into the stratosphere, and there was concern this could trigger some sort of global cooling. And basically all it did was it cooled the area underneath the smoke a little, because you had dense black clouds up there all the time. The sun wasn't shining through. People like to mock, duck, and cover. Frankly, if you're not that near to a nuclear bomb, it's excellent advice. Because the issues you're going to have light, you're going to have flash heat, and you're going to have the shock wave, which is going to break glass, it's going to knock things around. Ducking and covering says get out of the line of sight, cover your head, block your exposed skin. And frankly, that is great advice if you're not, so close that you simply are vaporized or hopelessly irradiated at the start. Fallout does not last for decades. And I'll give some exceptions to that. But you have sort of the idea of, we have this nuclear war and all the countryside is radioactive for years to come. Most fallout has a half-life of hours or days. To get something that has a half-life longer than that, you need to get materials that are long-lived isotopes. And most of those tend to collect around the blast. Yes, Jim?
Well, I used to live in, or near Hiroshima,
Uh-huh.
and when people would find out, they were always asking, does anybody live there? And is it radioactive? And it's like, no, people, I mean, it wiped out the center of the city, but people were doing stuff within days. I mean, they had streetcars up and running within a few days, and all sorts of other stuff. It's not something that causes as much problems as people think.
Now, ground-based destinations create more lasting fallout than airbursts. An airburst, something that's up a couple thousand feet, will actually produce almost no fallout. But a ground-based one will suck up a bunch of dirt, irradiate it, and will mix it with leftover material. When a nuclear bomb goes off, not all of the uranium and plutonium fissions. So you end up with this irradiated, uranium plutonium particles that mix with the dirt and spread around, but they're heavy. So they tend to settle out of the atmosphere closer. The real risk with fallout is usually not exposure. Most nuclear materials will produce alpha and beta particles, which will be stopped by your clothing, in some cases your skin. The dangerous ones are the ones that you inhale or ingest, because those get into your digestive system, those get into your lungs, and there they can have, even with alpha and beta particles, they can have serious negative effects. It's good to remember nuclear blast effects fall off at an inverse square rate, meaning it's 1/4 the impact at double the distance. There are some variations. I actually have government printing office text, the effects of nuclear weapons. I have pages after pages of charts and sheets based on actual nuclear tests, saying here are the actual effects, and it even has this nifty little nuclear effects calculator. Plug in the kilotons and the distance, and you can say here's what you're going to experience in terms of overpressure, or radiation, or heat, or so on and so forth. We like to talk a lot about EMP, but this is where it burns out. Basically, it induces, we found out that nuclear weapons create an electronic field, and if you move an electronic field through wires, it will create current. And we have devices that tend to operate on 5 to 12 volts, and you suddenly get 100 volts of induced current through there, and it burns it out. This is actually a very real issue. But if you have a ground-based blast, you tend to have a very limited region of EMP. It just doesn't travel that far from the blast. The truly dangerous EMP scenarios are a high altitude, above the atmosphere attack, because basically the air particles up there have a multiplying effect on the EMP effect. And you can get, in theory, with a single very large blast above the US, you can affect most of the continental US. If you want to read a very depressing novel, it's called, was it 1 Second After?
1 second after.
By William Forster, yeah. Because it's a scenario of an EMP there that basically burns out electronics over the US. Basically 90% of the US starves.
But it looks like this is saying pretty much you either have EMP problems or fallout, not both of them, because fallout is mostly.
Yeah, a high altitude blast would have zero fallout.
Yeah.
You'd have EMP around the region of the blast, but it's not going to be for tens of miles in all directions. And if it's in a place where you have a grid, it's going to send surges along that grid, so you can extend the effect that way. And frankly, our power grid is sufficiently in poor shape that a blast in certain places would probably knock out power for large areas, but it would be restorable by and large. So, got some useful references. I'll post these slides. Any further questions? Yes?
I have a couple. Well, first, I always kind of, in my mind, I always imagined that the aftermath of a nuclear blast would be like Chernobyl, where it's completely uninhabitable for years. But you're saying that that's not the case.
Well, Chernobyl isn't even uninhabitable. There's a lot of people living in and around Chernobyl. There's a lot of wildlife there. There's a lot of vegetation. There are people who moved out. There are certainly higher incidence of some kinds of cancers and so on. But no, there's a lot of stuff that could be cleaned up, but a lot of it is perception. And one of the most fascinating things in writing these novels, we don't have a publisher yet. Still working on an agent. But one of the fascinating things in the third novel, well, one of the books I got, wasn't required for the class, but I got it on recommendation of a teacher, is Responding to Catastrophic Events, Contingency Management and Policies. This is a fascinating book talking about all the ways in which the government responds to catastrophic events. And one of the key ideas, and this is something that was already coming up in writing the third novel, is what it calls a cascade effect. Even though these 3 blasts in the novel are all confined to the Bay Area, there is some fallout, but it's not going to be long lasting. But you're going to have a tremendous cascade effect. You have, for example, you have millions of Californians who, you have 3 blasts that are 2 or a half hour apart, the third one's 12 hours later. And people in the LA area and San Diego are like, we're getting out of here. And people in Northern California are, we're getting out of here. Suddenly have millions of Californians pouring across the border into Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. But Utah, I-80 is right in the fallout path.
They're heading to Oregon.
Yeah, Oregon is one of the 3. We actually have chapters with each of those states trying to figure out what they're going to do and what kind of policy. And for Nevada, it's particularly bad because northern Nevada is in the path. Utah is trying to do some evacuation. I actually have a chapter with a public service announcement by the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints saying, guys, we're leaving Utah temporarily. And yes, he talks about going back to Missouri. The economic cascade is devastating. Suddenly, no one's going to want to buy any vegetables out of the Central Valley because some are actually getting fallout, and who's going to trust the rest? You have statewide gridlock. Now, I'm from California. I know California well. You have this coastal strip from Mexico to north of San Francisco in which 98% of the population lives. The other 10% lives in the rest of the state. All of the freeways going out of California, they all narrow down to 2 lanes each way as you're going. And when you suddenly, this is something my wife and I have experienced. If you're on I-15 at the wrong time, like Sunday afternoon, and you're trying to get into California, you have 100 miles of stop-and-go traffic in the desert. Because you have everyone from Southern California who's returning back from a weekend in Las Vegas on a 2-lane freeway. So here you suddenly have statewide gridlock in California. So you just shut down all deliveries, you've shut down all transportation, you've severely limited the ability of emergency services to react. You have difficulties of coordinating. This part is from Larson's book. Trying to coordinate federal, state, and local officials. And there are actual constitutional issues involved there as far as who can do what. It is what has been most fascinating for me in writing these has been not just the impact of the blasts themselves, but the cascade effect across the rest of the country and the absolute devastating effect it has on the economy. Particularly since, again, Silicon Valley, you've got Apple, you've got Google, you've got Facebook, you've you've got, Stanford, you've got Berkeley, and basically people are dead and the area is being evacuated, and will probably be evacuated for years to come. How to recover from that. Anyway, so, any other questions? Yes?
Time for comments yet, or?
Oh, yeah, no, please, comments are great. Especially with your background, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Nothing back there. My name is David Montgomery. I'm a friend of David Butler. We've known each other for some 25 years. I retired from BYU, taught history, Russia and the Near East, but what I have to say doesn't mean anything to that.
Oh.
I am, just turned 79 years old. I was born in 1940. I grew up in the somewhat medium west suburbs of Chicago. And O'Hare Field, which was then a military base, was about 3 miles to the north from us. But that doesn't mean anything either. But what really meant things, I learned to read in my first introduction to the media photographic magazines time in life. I read about the Holocaust, and I read about the nuclear explosions. I was introduced at the tender age of 6 to nasty things. And then we moved out from central Chicago to the farther west suburbs, 4 miles south of O'Hare Field, which then was an Air Force base. And every day at 2-hour intervals, a flight of swept-winged, silver, yellow-nosed F-86s took off. We lived in the traffic pattern, took off flying north or landing south, to go north of Chicago, flying in a racetrack pattern to wait for the Russian bombers to come. That was one thing. And then my dad would take us to the Lake Michigan beaches. And along the beaches, the swimming beaches of Lake Michigan, every 100 yards was a double-mounted 76mm Sky Sweeper anti-aircraft gun with its own autonomous radar system, in case the Russians came in low over the lake. In the forest clearings of the Chicago Forest Reserves, there were Nike missile batteries or heavy 90mm long-range high-altitude anti-aircraft guns. So this set the background for things. Also, the Chicago newspapers every now and then would publish a map showing the Chicago area, and if an atom bomb were dropped at the corner of State and Madison in downtown Chicago, it was always State and Madison, but every 6 months such an issue would be published, and every 6 months the circle of damage crept outward. And eventually, after a couple of years, the circle of damage came to my house. It was a very real thing with the jet planes, the anti-aircraft guns, the circles of damage, and also the air raid drills into the fallout shelters in the basement of our schools. It was the impeding atomic war was an everyday thing of our life. I don't think we worried about it. It was just it's going to happen someday. And I've grown up my whole life saying it's going to happen. And it happened, and I'm very thankful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, great. And, you know, I'm several years behind you, but being a Navy brat, I'm keenly aware of various military procedures. And of course, growing up in San Diego, which is a Navy town, we were pretty much a major target ourselves. So my dad would, for years, talk about wanting to move to northwest Idaho because he figured that was safe from most of the fallout.
Oh, and one other
They
thing.
did. Oh, yes.
There were still farmlands around there. And we boys, with our wooden guns, would play in the cornfields, being guerrilla fighters against the Russian paratroops.
There you go.
It's sort of like that Tom Cruise,
Oh, yeah.
that Tom Cruise movie, Red Storm.
Yeah.
That was it. That was my life.
Yes.
Russians are coming. The bombs are falling.
My question kind of ties into what you were just saying. So I'm a couple generations removed. My aunt was, her childhood was very similar, and she told me about waking up in the middle of the night with nightmares because the Russians were going to bomb. And this was in the 50s. So my question is, my mother was a little bit younger. She was growing up in the 1960s. Your chart said that objectively the danger was much higher because there were so many more nuclear weapons in play. And yet, she does not report about her childhood any of that same kind of paranoia. And so I was wondering if you had any ideas why that would be. Is it just like social fatigue?
That's actually a good question because I actually do remember a fair amount. I'm old enough to remember in 5th grade coming to school in 1963 and having one of my friends say, my father said the world might end today. That was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When we came very close to nuclear, probably the closest we ever were to an active nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So we had the monthly siren would always go off for air raid drills, and we knew where fallout shelters were and so on and so forth. But I think it may have been less intense by then because it was almost sort of, I don't want to say blasé, but it's kind of like, yeah, this is something we're living with. You want? Oh, well, let's question here first.
Are you aware of any small tactical testing in the United States, like in the missile test range in northern Utah?
Of tactical testing of nuclear weapons? No.
I had an experience.
Officially, there has been no tactical testing, no testing of any nuclear devices since 1992.
Okay, I think it was in 1959.
Oh,
if I get my dates right.
Oh, so you're saying, were they ever testing up there?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I was rabbit hunting out past Grantsville, Bragg, I don't know if you know where that is. I was walking south up a hill, and I got hit with a shock wave that shoved me down. I stumbled forward. I turned around and looked north, and there was a mushroom cloud.
Oh, it was probably, yeah.
And
There was a lot of places where we were laying off nuclear weapons in the 50s.
Yeah.
And even in the 60s
It was very
as well.
tall mushroom, very.
Oh, yeah.
Sitting with a little cloud up
Yep.
there, but
No, I'm sure that was it.
they did do some testing.
I don't know personally,
I
but
did
yeah, I'm sure
hear-
they did.
I did hear by word of mouth that
Yeah,
there was a submarine side missile test.
Okay.
Wasn't there a whole issue about these downwinders where they were?
That was mostly out of southern Utah,
Yeah.
getting stuff drifting in from Nevada, but yes,
Yeah.
that is a significant issue. You had a question.
Yeah, so
Or comment.
you've laid out here both a real world possibility on, India, Pakistan,
Yeah.
exchange of tactical nuclear weapons, and then
My
the
scenario,
fictional
yeah.
scenario. I think the harder scenario to imagine, I wonder if you have an idea for this, is actually an effective non-proliferation. And one of the things you addressed at the beginning was that one of the major obstacles in the past 20 years has been Russia still having concerns that they don't quite trust non-proliferation.
Actually, Soviets trust non-proliferation. Non-proliferation treaty basically says there are 5 authorized nuclear states and no one else is legally allowed to have them.
Yeah.
5 being Russia, America, China, France, and UK. You have about 5 other states that have them, have them in violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. You have a number of other states which have tried to get them or are trying to get them and have not. The part of the thing is that back in the 60s there was a fear that proliferation was going to be very fast, and it didn't happen. Actually, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was amazingly effective. You basically have 1.5 new nuclear states per decade is the rate of proliferation. And the additional states with nuclear weapons tend to be, be more regionally limited in what they can do and so on. One interesting tidbit, France. France has been almost entirely independent with its nuclear program, which started right after World War II. Meaning it didn't cooperate, it's not controlled by NATO, they have full control over it. They haven't cooperated with anyone else, and their stated policy is tout azimuts, which means towards all horizons. Soviet nuclear policy, or excuse me, French nuclear policy isn't we're deterring Russia. It's we'll bomb whoever we darn well please, so don't mess with us. They have their own nuclear submarine fleet, they have their own nuclear weapons program, they have their own, they are fiercely independent in their nuclear program. So, if you're talking about further non-proliferation, there's actually a lot of effort to control that proliferation. And generally speaking, it's more successful than anyone thought it would be. If you're talking about disarmament, which is something else, nuclear disarmament, there are a number of reasons why I don't think it will happen. One of it is there just isn't sufficient political trust and, frankly, cooperation among major states for that to happen. The other, and this was something we discussed in class, and it was something I hypothesized, and Dr. Karshner laughed and he said, we've actually wargamed that. I said, what would happen if say, an alien civilization came and said, oh, we come bringing peace, we wave our wand. Said, all of your nuclear weapons have just vanished. The outcome would be a tremendous outbreak in conventional warfare. Because there would be a lot of wars that would be started up because there would not be nuclear deterrence to stop them. And conventional deterrence would not be sufficient to do that. It's one thing for us to sit here and threaten, let's consider America as a nuclear deterrent. It's one thing for us to say, don't mess with, this ally because we have nukes. It's another thing for saying you just invaded our ally and you're 8,000 miles away and we're not sure we have the logistic supply lines to suddenly try and, bring in 100,000 troops to counter what you're doing.
We don't have it right now for NATO.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And that's
Europe right now, there is not sufficient material there. We can move 2.5 divisions in under 48 hours, but that's it.
Yeah.
And those are all light. Not one of those is armored.
And it's not like NATO forces or European forces are all that great. They're pretty pathetic actually. And that's not jingoism talking. That's just the truth. European military forces are pretty sparse and pretty underperforming.
A good book to read is Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising.
Yeah. Because that postulates sort of the escalation you have.
Heading toward the edge.
Yeah. Anyway, that's it, unless there's any more questions. Thanks for coming. This was fun.
Thank you all for being here. There's no rush to leave. There are 4 different